chapter, verse 7, and working our way through the rest of the chapter today. Before we look at it, I want to remind you today to be in prayer for Larry and Joanne Hazlett. So, Isaiah chapter 53, Pastor Mike started us out in 52 yesterday, and as he said, this is obviously, you can't read through this without seeing the story of our Savior, without seeing the crucifixion and the purpose of Christ here to come and save the lost, a sheep who've went their own way, turned away from God, and He came to bring us back. And it's the same way here in this second part of the chapter. It's all about Christ and what He did for us. It talks plainly about the crucifixion, about His rejection, and I think even the resurrection is mentioned here in this chapter. Every verse tells us something. Every verse here gives us an image, a hint, a foreshadowing of what Christ was going to do. I think for my part, just verse 7 stands out to me. He who was oppressed and he was afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth, like a lamb that is led to the slaughter, and like a sheep that before its shearers is silent, so he opened not his mouth. And of course that takes us in mind back to the part of the story where we know that Christ stood before them and in their court in trial and refused to defend himself. He stayed silent. He knew what was happening. The crucifixion, when it comes to the Christ, is one of those things that is so difficult, you see, for the Jewish people to understand. Even though they have this passage here in Isaiah that talks about the suffering servant and what he was going to do, they believed in the Christ, they believed in the Messiah, but they believed that he was going to come and he was going to conquer and he was going to be this leader that threw down the Gentile nations, that reestablished Israel as this dominant force that brought them back into their glory days, the descendant of David. And yet you see that even when we just read it yesterday in John chapter 12 as Jesus is going to about be crucified. I say we saw it yesterday. I'm talking about youth group. We read John chapter 12. And as Jesus is on his way, towards the crucifixion, some of the Jewish people are around him and they're asking, well, you're talking about being lifted up. They knew he was talking about his death. And they say, well, how can the Son of Man be lifted up if the Christ is supposed to remain forever? If you're going to be Christ, how can you die? We don't understand how that works. And yet that was the part, that was the truth of how the Christ was going to achieve salvation was through his death and through his suffering. And it just didn't track in their minds. They didn't understand it. And when we read about Christ, not defending himself like a lamb to the slaughter, he was silent. Could he have defended himself? Absolutely. It wasn't as if he didn't have anything to say. He was righteous. He was innocent. He didn't deserve what was happening to him. But his silence reminds us of what he was doing. This wasn't a surprise. He was silent, not because he didn't have anything to say or he couldn't defend himself, but he was silent for me and for you. He restrained himself, his right to defend himself. Could he have freed himself? Absolutely. Could he have spoken up? Yes. But he wouldn't have achieved what he did in saving us if he had spoken up. He stayed silent because of his love for us, because of his desire to bring us righteousness, to bring us back into a right relationship with God. He knew he was going to take the punishment for the sins that should have been upon us. He knew that was happening. Let me see here. There was another interesting part. Well, of course, it's all interesting, but I think verse 10 here, yet it was the will of the Lord to crush him. He has put him to grief. We know that this is the reason God sent him. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. He shall prolong his days. And it's referring to the same one who said that he was going to be crushed and he was going to, his grave was going to be with the wicked and his rich man in his death. He was going to die. And yet at the same time, once he makes this offering, he's going to prolong his days and is going to see his offspring. How does that work? How can he be dead and yet prolong his days? And I think that that's just another interesting foreshadowing here of the resurrection of Christ. Yeah, he was going to be sacrificed, and yet he was going to rise up in victory. It wasn't the end of the story. And even, you see the disciples didn't understand that, even though he had told them time and time again what was going to happen, that he was going to be raised back up after his crucifixion. They sort of didn't know what to do with themselves. They didn't know. They were depressed, and of course they would be, but they didn't understand it. That wasn't the end of the story. Verse 11, out of the anguish of his soul he shall see and be satisfied. By his knowledge shall the righteous one, my servant, make many to be accounted righteous, and he shall bear their iniquities. And that's his whole purpose. And I'm just thankful for this passage today. There's so much in here, and as there's any one of these verses we could sit and meditate on and just say, Lord, speak to me, reveal to me the truth of this passage. But obviously, let's continue to meditate on the love of God and what he was willing to do. And for me today, it's thinking about the fact that he stayed silent for me. When we are being wronged in our flesh, especially when we know that we're not in the wrong, it's natural for us to defend ourselves or want to speak up for ourselves. And part of that is just our fleshly desire to kind of get our way or to make sure that we're not wrong. But here we have Christ willing to be wronged, and he would have been right to speak up for himself, but he stayed silent for us because he knew what he was accomplishing, the righteousness that he was bringing. Thankful for the passage. If God spoke something to you out of this passage today, leave us a message on Facebook, on YouTube. Remember to minister to one another. God bless you guys, and thank you for taking time to listen to this.